Okay, thanks very much, Cliff. Your knack for scheduling the timeliness of these things never ceases to amaze me. This is, as you said, an extremely timely session. Let me join you in welcoming everybody here to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies for what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating discussion on the rapidly moving situation inside of Syria. Over just the past week or so, we've witnessed a series of extraordinary developments. The commencement of sustained, full-on pitched battles in the streets of Damascus, a decapitation strike against the regime's inner sanctum that killed at least 3 of its most important security figures, including the president's own brother-in-law, while injuring several of his other chief confidants and enforcers. And what appears to be, as of yesterday, the takeover by rebel forces of several Syrian border posts with Turkey and Iraq. So quite all of a sudden, it seems, after 16 months of a horrifically brutal slog in which one of the region's most heavily armed and vicious police states mercilessly unleashed its firepower day after day against a largely unarmed population, the endgame for the Assad regime may now, at long last, be upon us. I think a lot of people have been caught out by how quickly this inflection point has been reached and how rapidly things now appear to be coming apart for the regime. But for those who have followed the situation more closely, I think there's a bit less surprise at work. I remember myself talking to some of my colleagues here at FDD in the first week of June, sifting through random snippets of evidence and raising the possibility that amidst all the horrific daily death tolls, something may have begun to qualitatively shift in the nature of the fight, that a corner may have been turned in terms of the capabilities of the Free Syrian Army, the weaknesses of the regime, the amount of territory that had been lost or ceded to the opposition's control, and the inevitability that Assad's fall was coming, and perhaps, if we're lucky, even much sooner than most of us had once thought possible. By mid-June, those kinds of hunches were being confirmed in the writings of some of Washington's best military analysts who for months and months have followed in some excruciating detail each twist and turn in the daily struggle between the FSA and the regime. People like Joe Holliday at the Institute for the Study of War and Jeff White at the Washington Institute. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us someone else, David Enders, who's closely followed and chronicled the evolution of this war, who indeed has witnessed it firsthand and comes to us more or less directly from the front lines. It's a all too rare opportunity in Washington to hear the insights and observations of someone who spent a month on the ground with Syria's rebels and has an immediate and intimate feel for the dynamics of that struggle and where it may be headed in the coming weeks and months. Perhaps even more important, David has very direct experience and knowledge of the rebels themselves and can perhaps shed some light, at least, on the $64,000 question that's bedeviled analysts and policymakers alike for the better part of the last year and a half, and without question has served as one of the biggest obstacles and constraints, less charitable people might say excuses, on U.S. decision-making toward this crisis. And that's the question of who are these people? What do they believe? What kind of Syria do they want to see? And what will likely happen if they get control of the state? And what will it mean for U.S. interests? Of course, even if I'm right, and in the immortal words of Frank Sinatra, that great historian of Middle East despots, Assad is about to start singing the opening lines to My Way. You all know it. You can sing along. And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. The fact is that no one can predict how many acts this endgame is going to have, exactly how long it will last, or how it will ultimately be resolved. A lot of the story remains to be written. How it unfolds could have dramatic impact on the future of Syria and the region. Assad may be going, but he's not gone yet, and in between here and there, he retains an enormous capacity to wreak havoc, destruction, and instability on a scale that would make even the carnage of the past 16 months look like small potatoes. Fears that he may deploy his arsenal of chemical weapons, ballistic missiles, and perhaps even some biological agents against the population have all become too plausible. Even short of that, the unleashing of his air force and artillery in a Dresden-style bombing campaign of major urban areas, or the dramatic escalation by pro-regime militias of an ethnic cleansing spree that leads to massacres not just in the hundreds, but the thousands are all real possibilities, as are the dangers of a major escalation beyond Syria's borders, as the rapidly deteriorating situation compels some neighboring countries to act in defense of their own strategic interests. Of course, we may get lucky. We may dodge a bullet. Maybe Assad will wake up tomorrow or the next day or next week and decide to pick up his family and board a Russian jet, takes him into exile in Moscow or Caracas or Tehran. Maybe the collapse of his regime will happen, not with a bang, but with a whimper. But I think you'd be hard-pressed right now to find many Syria analysts prepared to give you odds on that eventuality. It's hard, if not impossible, after watching the trajectory of this conflict for 16 months, to believe that it ends well for anyone, or that there's still not enormous bloodshed and tragedy in front of us, with the only question being how much and with what consequences for Syria and the region. So I'll be very interested to hear from our panelists what they believe the immediate future likely holds in store for us, what the likely contingencies are, and what, if anything, the rest of the world may be able to do about them. Lost a page from my my presentation, excuse me. Discuss all these questions and more, including important questions about U.S. policy and what the U.S. can and should be doing. It's a pleasure to be joined by a great panel of experts. I've already mentioned, first up we'll have David Enders, a journalist and Pulitzer Prize grantee on crisis reporting, who will be providing us with a first-hand account of his extended period on the ground with Syria's rebels. David currently writes for McClatchy, and we're delighted to welcome him here to FDD. I'll also acknowledge the assistance of Mark Siebel. I don't know if he's in the room or not, for arranging and helping to have David join us here. After David's report, I'll turn to two of my outstanding colleagues at FDD. First will be Ammar Abdulhamid, a longtime Syria Democratic activist and senior fellow at FDD. Ammar writes the indispensable blog Syria Revolution Digest, and his perspectives and role with Syria's political and its armed opposition have been vital and crucial. Finally, we'll hear from Reuel Gerecht, another senior fellow at FDD and one of Washington's most prolific, knowledgeable, and very happily provocative commentators on Middle East affairs. As most of you know, Reuel himself is a former operative in the CIA's clandestine service, and he most recently wrote a very interesting and even compelling piece in the Wall Street Journal on getting the CIA much more deeply involved in resolving the Syria conflict in a way that begins to meet some U.S. interests. Now, after our speakers finish, I'll ask some questions initially to get the conversation going, and then we'll happily open it up to your questions from the audience. Just wait for me to call on you. Please identify yourself. We do have cameras rolling. Let me also remind everyone that the session's on the record, and if you haven't done so already, please silence your cell phones. With that, let me turn it over to David Enders.
First of all, thank you for having me. If you can't hear me in the back, just, I don't know, give me a signal. I'll try to stay close to the mic. I should correct, that's Pulitzer Center, not Pulitzer Prize. Although
okay,
that's quite an honor. I appreciate that. So I've been into Syria 4 times since the middle of February. 3 times crossing illegally, once on a visa. I find it's almost easier to work going in illegally. You don't have the constraints of a ministry threatening to arrest you, or I mean, a very real risk of arrest for trying to do any real reporting, especially now that the United Nations monitors are no longer moving. When they were there, journalists were sort of allowed to draft off them and move around. And so that made it a little easier as far as freedom of movement. And we did find that there was some freedom of movement if you were prepared to take risks, but then we were also detained and nearly arrested, which would have been obviously very bad for my Syrian colleagues. So that's given me about maybe 2 months of almost 2 months of actual reporting inside the country, largely in the areas around Homs, not actually in Homs itself. The rebels have not allowed journalists to travel with them into Homs itself since the end of February. We've made repeated requests to try and get in there, but I think being in the area around it does give a pretty good sense of what's going on, and I was able to visit it briefly while following the monitors and kind of get an idea of at least some of the destruction that's taken place. As John was saying, what we're seeing in the last few days does not come as a terrible surprise. In the last month, I was there most of June, and what we saw was that north of Homs, and especially north of Hama, the rebels control a considerable amount of territory and are beginning to function as a de facto government in some areas, especially rural areas. They were in a number of city centers until February and March when they were pushed out, and what seems to be happening is the rebellion just keeps growing. I mean, everywhere you go, they still say, we have more men who are willing to fight than we actually have weapons for them. And I think that's very true. And we see tens of thousands of refugees going to Turkey, going to Lebanon. The Turkish refugee camps have become incubators for the rebels. They've become places where they train, share information. They've become staging grounds. Crossing the Turkish border seems to be increasingly easy. We were briefly detained by the Turkish soldiers coming out who didn't really know what to do with us, told the Syrian guys I was with to go back over the border, wait 5 minutes for their commander to leave, and then walk back. And while they were detaining us, there were a whole bunch of other guys who were running across. They go, the soldiers are occupied, let's go. So, I mean, there are more people coming across the Turkish border than they can really handle. And that's, I think, an indicator of just what's going on. As far as the fighting in Damascus, it's still confined, I think, to neighborhoods that have been very anti-regime since the beginning. I was in Yarmouk and Tadaman in May, and there was a lot of tension. There were demonstrations. There was a lot of rock throwing. There were some small bombings, presumably by the rebels against Syrian security forces inside those neighborhoods. So at that time, the people there were very in support of having the FSA inside their neighborhoods. They wanted them there. The neighborhoods were also very much full of refugees from Homs, from Hama, from other parts of the country. So I think that's another reason you're seeing these neighborhoods specifically start to fight. And although now the fighting has come to Damascus, and symbolically that's extremely important, and it makes it very hard for people on the fence to ignore, which is one thing you hear the rebels talk about is now that it's moved to Damascus, people can't pretend like this isn't happening, that it's not real. There's no guarantee that this is going to be very quick. I mean, I think we're looking at something that's very protracted. There are a number of people who are part of a very large government security apparatus who are probably looking around right now going, I'm dead or I'm forced to leave the country, obviously, if these rebels succeed. So unfortunately, I think we may be just looking at the beginning of a much more serious situation, a much more serious conflict where people everywhere are just forced to pick sides or flee. And so I'll leave it there and pass it along.
Ammar. Sure. Well, I want to just amplify some of the things that David has said in terms of the the reach of better. In terms of the reach of the actual rebels and what that means, really, especially considering the developments of the last few days. One thing is very clear, and yesterday I was actually watching a YouTube video that was produced on the 18th of the rebels in the north, especially in the north part of Aleppo. They have come together and formed a unified council of the north part of Aleppo in particular, and they've sort of carried a show of strength, and you can see convoys for about 10 minutes. Basically, the video is that long, and you can see just convoys of vehicles passing near the camera, by the camera, and it's all rebel soldiers. So that's something that's there are about 150 cars of all, so that's very impressive for that part of the country. And now that they are not only willing to show their strength publicly, but at the same time to hold such a large showing of force. So the northern parts of Syria, more or less, are really by now under rebel control. Different, however, rebel groups in the north, in that part of Aleppo, they are trying to come together. They formed a unified command, and you can tell from the names as well that they tend to be now Islamist in character. They call it Al-Tawheed Brigade, and the level of Islamization that's taken place at the same time is one of those trends that we have to keep monitoring, because it seems to me that this is going to be a trend that's going to continue. And it's bred by the fact that a lot of the people sending weapons are sending weapons particularly to Islamic groups, and at the same time the increasing frustration with the international community and the fact that no one is doing anything to support the rebels. They are really being pushed into the one direction that exists out there that gives them some support and some comfort psychologically and some strength in the days ahead, which is as usual God and jihad, and so it's not really a very surprising development. Many cities and towns in northern Aleppo have come under rebel control. The Kurdish areas, I'll talk about that in a few minutes because they are dancing to their different tunes, but now the Kurdish areas in all of the country have, the local populations have taken control of even the political security apparatuses, the police stations, and they have thrown away the Assad officials completely. Before that, before yesterday, in fact, there was only this uneasy coexistence between the sort of the Ba'ath command and the security forces and the Kurdish leaders and activists, but now that coexistence is no longer there. The people simply took complete control of the situation in their territories and in their countries. And I think one of the things that facilitated this move was the recent agreement signed between the different Kurdish factions, especially the faction known as PYD, which is the Syrian equivalent of the PKK, and a faction called the Kurdish National Council, which combines most other Kurdish opposition groups inside Syria. By signing an accord in Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, under the patronage of the President Barzani, they have really formed some kind of unity government, a power-sharing arrangement in their own territory. So now you have a Kurdish region that's definitely autonomous and has taken control there. I've seen videos also of Peshmerga, basically fighters being trained locally, and so they are even providing for their own policing right now. So the Kurdish regions have also, in a sense, separated, you can say, from the established structure and have created their own autonomous reality. So you have this, and then you have in the north, as we said before, the northern part of rural Aleppo coming under the control of rebel groups. You have in Aleppo city itself, while all people are focusing on Damascus, Aleppo city itself is gradually falling to the control of the local resistance and the FSA. Almost 60% of the neighborhoods now really are under the control of people who are sympathetic to the revolution, and we've seen now larger demonstrations in fact taking place, and this is only a development that happened in the last 48 hours. So so the situation is that fluid, as we are talking about it right now. So but we're talking about all of this. One thing that's very clear is all of these areas that are under rebel control are being bombarded. not the Kurdish areas, but the areas in Idlib, in Aleppo, and Homs, all of them are being bombarded. The rebels cannot stop. They can take control of the cities, but they cannot prevent heavy artillery from targeting their communities. They cannot prevent the helicopter gunships from shelling their communities. This is a challenge. So if the regime cannot really take over towns and reestablish their control over these towns, but at the same time, the rebels, when they establish their control over certain cities, they cannot protect it against the mortar shells and against missiles. And unless there is a willingness on part of the international community to begin striking the heavy artillery positions, to strike the airports from which the helicopter gunships are coming, or at least to give the rebels Stinger missiles so they can take care of the job on their own, we are talking about a very worsening situation. We're talking about a situation that will continue to be deadly. We're talking about a situation where control on either side means absolutely nothing. Bashar al-Assad is still there, capable of wreaking havoc, but is not capable of establishing real control. The rebels capable of establishing physical control, but they're not capable of fending off against the mortar rounds and the missiles. So the death will continue, and the dissolution of the country will continue. The ethnic cleansing will also continue. This is the other part of the story, and perhaps, David, during the question and answer session, you can tell us more about your own observation, because the ethnic cleansing is happening exactly in the areas, or at least I can tell. You will tell us more and perhaps correct the impression. But my feeling is that the ethnic cleansing is happening in central Syria, and that Assad really wants to retain control of Homs city. I mean, already 3/4 of the population, the Sunni population, have left the city, and Assad is busy razing to the ground the areas that they have left. All these Sunni neighborhoods, basically, that rose up against the regimes are being leveled as we speak. There has been continuous bombardment, non-stop shelling for almost 2 months now of Homs city and of surrounding towns like Tel Bise, like Houle, like Qusayr, like Tal Kalakh. It's the idea is to destroy completely, frankly, these cities, not simply to take them over and put Alawite residents. There is no enough numbers, basically, for among the Alawite community or the Christians to take over these cities. So the idea is to simply raze them to the ground and make sure that there is no place for the Sunni population to come back to. Ethnic cleansing is also happening north of Homs in the Idlib province and the Hama province, and the idea is to push as much of the Sunni population as possible to the western parts of the Orontes River. The scenario for partition continues to be Plan B, but it's the Plan B that's now almost becoming the Plan A at the same time. I mean, Plan A is to re-establish control over the country and to make sure that the opposition is defeated. This is not happening, but Plan B, which is working in parallel, is to make sure that there is a majority Alawite and Christian enclave on the coastal areas and in central part of Syria. And this is the plan that seems to be working. However, even with this plan, and now with Assad being more and more embattled, it's really hard to see how considering the resistance that's still taking place inside Homs itself, and the fact that after 2 months of pounding and shelling, the control has not been reestablished, you would wonder at what point Assad would realize these people are not going to give up, and yet this is the only plan I have. So what am I going to do? This is where the WMD situation gets into consideration. And when you consider the fact that it's the State Department that leaked the reports that the WMDs or some WMD stockpiles were shifted from Damascus in the direction of Homs, the situation becomes that much more ominous. And I think the debate in this country, in these policy-making circles here, should shift from what are we going to do in case there is a WMD attack to what should be done to preempt this. I mean, this is not Halabja. We are seeing the signs on the ground. This is not some kind of an isolated incident that came by surprise. We're talking about an ethnic cleansing campaign. We can see the patterns. And now we're seeing movement of WMDs. We see a regime that's being embattled. We see a pattern of behavior whereby, the Assad are getting more and more bloody and more deadly. And the more wounded they become, the more threatened they become, the more they unleash hell on everybody. So we cannot really just discount the possibility that the WMD that has been moved is going to be used. So instead of waiting for it to happen, instead of waiting for the crime to happen and for thousands of people to die on us, and as we're watching within the next, I don't know, is it going to be tomorrow or the day after or the day after? But instead of waiting for that, while we can see all the signs and basically on the wall, I think it's time for us to act, to preempt this possibility. It's not enough to send the message. The message needs to be sent not by simply having a statement issued by the White House. I think the only message that can be sent is by having airstrikes against certain targets. Not the WMD targets, but once you target the heavy artillery and you say, look, we are going that far, we are willing to use violence, we are willing to do it, then the message might percolate in the minds of the Assad that, hey, this is getting serious. Because right now the international community is not serious. You know, to be taken seriously by the Assad is to actually show yourself willing to get down and dirty with them. But to actually say, you know, we are going to, you know, have sanctions, we are going to issue a statement against you, this doesn't make any sense and has not produced any results in the last 16 months. So we are not talking from a theoretical position here. So we have now an experience with the Assad and that we have established for the last 16 months. We've seen patterns on the ground, and we know that the ways of that we have used so far to deal with the situation are not working. They are not producing the kind of results that we want. So we really have to reconsider the strategies. And if the Obama administration is going to be always focused on winning these elections and now forget about Syria, we can put it aside. I think by the time the elections come, and assuming they win, we may not have a country that's viable at that stage. Or the massacre might have already taken place. The WMD might have already been used. The facts on the ground are moving too fast. And they are really, in a sense, unpredictable, and not in that we're not going to know what's going to happen. What's going to happen is more ethnic cleansing, more killing, and potential use of WMD. That's what's going to happen. But exactly at what rate? Is it going to be tomorrow that we're going to have the large massacre, or the day after? Are other parts of Damascus going to get out of the regime's control? Are we going to start having revenge killings now that the fighters are getting more and more frustrated? You know, these are the kind of unpredictable elements that could happen, but the pattern itself is very predictable. The timing of some of the events, as I said, the WMD use and so on, may not be exact timing may not be predictable, but the pattern is there. The pattern is predictable, and the partitioning of the country is happening. And even with intervention, it's going to be a long process. And it's not going to be a nice process. It's going to be a violent process of trying to put the pieces of the puzzle back together, even with intervention. Without intervention, the pieces of the puzzle are not going to be put back together, and there will be ramification for Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq and Turkey. And I think one of the reasons we have, in fact, in the north, we've seen the Kurdish region sort of asserting themselves, and we have this accord between the different groups. Of course, there is Turkish sponsorship indirectly working at that. So they're trying to secure their own borders because they can see the patterns on the ground, and they realize that things are really getting out of control. I hope the administration will wise up before it's too late, but I don't have much. You know, I hope against hope. Let's put it this way.
Thanks, Ammar. Reuel.
Well, I suppose I'll pick up where Ammar left with the administration and just say that I sincerely hope that the president's luck continues and that he can, within 30 to 60 days, claim Syria as a victory for his wise and astute foreign policy of non-intervention. I suspect that will not be the case, though I certainly hope the dynamic develops so it is the case. I think if you look at Iraq, and there are some parallels here, if you look at Iraq and you examine the enmity that existed between the Sunni and the Shia community in Iraq, and then you magnify it perhaps by, I don't know, power of 10, then I think you have something of an idea of what's at play between the Alawi and the Sunni. In Iraq, you had the advantage that most Shia families there was a lot of commingling between the Shia and the Sunni. Most Shia families have any historical sense knew that their ancestors of 100 to 200 years ago were Sunni. So there were a lot of breaks, internal breaks in the system that mitigated the desire for revenge, intikham, and slaughter. I think those breaking mechanisms are a lot less in Syria, and it is easy to imagine killing on a scale that we saw in Lebanon, which I believe, if you were to add up all the body counts, population percentages, is still the highest kill rate that we have seen in the modern Middle East. I would expect in internal internecine strife, I would expect something like that, except even worse maybe in Syria. I don't think the Obama administration is probably going to be compelled to intervene by the humanitarian loss. I think we have clearly seen that it has no desire to play any strategic calculations. If that had been the case, a desire to wound Iran severely, a desire to drive Putin's remaining base in the Middle East out, a desire to simply just get even for all the American blood that has been shed by the Assad regime over the years, would have been compelling, I think, to at least unleash the agency. And I'd emphasize that unleash is a little ferocious word. I mean, the Syrian case is almost tailor-made for an agency covert action. I mean, this one you don't have to be, it doesn't take rocket science to do this one. They have not done it. They won't do it. There's certainly no desire in Langley to encourage them to do it. So I don't see strategic calculations coming into play. And again, the humanitarian loss, I mean, I don't know what the figure, they keep saying 17,000, 20,000. I suspect the real figure is a lot higher than that. Certainly the US government thinks the figure is a lot higher than that. So what's the difference? What's the difference between 40,000 and 60,000? I mean, I suppose if you could see, graphic footage day and night coming into your, living room, bedroom, whatever, but I don't think we're going to see that. So I can easily see the death rate just accelerating rapidly and it not having any impact really in Washington. I wish that were not the case. I hope sincerely that slaughter somehow motivates where strategic calculations did not, but I'm skeptical. I do think there is the wild card here, and it's a pretty profound wild card, and that's Turkey. Now, it's obvious that Erdogan and particularly the Turkish army do not really want to get involved. However, Erdogan has made it clear, I mean, the bridge has been broken, the ties with Assad are finished. Erdogan and the AKP are certainly on the side of the rebellion now. They just don't really want to get involved. However, Turkey does have a dynamic internal political calculation. This is closely followed by the Turkish press. The Sunni Shia animus is actually broken out in Turkey, which is not necessarily a very good thing for the Alevi, but it started in Turkey. So it is possible to imagine a situation, particularly if Aleppo continues to move in the direction of the rebellion, or if slaughter occurs in Aleppo, and because of the enormous ties between the Aleppo business community and the Turkish business community, particularly in the south of Turkey, to which Erdogan is highly sensitive to, very acute, because that is one of the bases of power of the party. I think it is possible that you could see the Turks become much more aggressive. It's possible. I'm not saying it's likely, but it is certainly possible, and it would be much more telling than either the Saudis or the Qataris, who I think will remain totally hopeless, or the Jordanians, who are a little bit better than hopeless, but this is way beyond their leagues. The Turks could do this. It's possible. And if the Turks were to do it, then I could see President Obama leading from behind again. So it's possible you could then get American input. You could have greater American activity. You could have the agency, working with the Turks and coordinating the delivery of better weaponry. Though I still think, as Ammar pointed out, if you've got heavy artillery and you're dropping it down on a city level, I mean, that's a fairly convincing argument. And it's very difficult to see them overcoming that if there's no internal break in the Alawi mindset. If they're not fearing, for example, there is a point of slaughter whereby they could lose the Sunni components of the Syrian army. If there's no fear of that, then I see no reason why they just don't slaughter everything. And the only way you're going to take out that heavy stuff, I think, is through some type of air action. I just don't see, unless the opposition somehow can get close to that, unless there can be some internal break inside of the forces themselves, then I'm skeptical how you take out these units. You can take out the helicopters, you can take out all of that if the Americans and the Turks were to deliver the right type of weaponry. So a lot could be done, and you could add, you want to create some situation that the regime doesn't expect, that doom and gloom really sinks in, and that the Alawi begin to, reassess their loyalty to the Assad family. I'm skeptical that, given how well the Assad family has played this, I'm skeptical that you're going to get the Alawi community to break, because I think they correctly understand that their only alternatives are going to be exile or death, or otherwise they have to throw themselves on the mercy of the Sunni community. And somehow I just don't see them going there. But that's if you're going to have a slither of hope, that's where the hope is at. That you've got to somehow militarily, through new equipment, through new tactics, change the dynamics so they really feel the doom and gloom. Otherwise, as I said in the beginning, I certainly hope what we've seen in the last few days does produce some unexpected unraveling, and that President Obama can go before us on television and say, see, I was right.
Great, thank you, Reuel. A lot on the table, lots about U.S. policy, but let me first turn to David to see if I can get you to talk a little bit about your actual experience with the rebels that you did travel with, and just get a bit more granularity for what you make of them, who they are, what motivates them politically. Are they seized with the kinds of issues of revenge and retribution that Reuel discusses? Ammar mentioned the increasing pace of Islamization of the rebel forces as they feel increasingly abandoned and left alone to face Assad with their only help from other Islamist and jihadist forces in the region. I wonder if you can kind of drill down in that and give us your own sense of reality of what it is that you saw.
Well, I think everything we've just heard is pretty much true. The sectarian nature of the conflict, especially around Homs, it's very acute. We are seeing what does appear in some cases to be the Syrian military or pro-government militias clearing out the area to the west of the Orontes River and forcing Sunni villagers east of that river. That's articulated all the time by rebels and residents of that area. And I mean, I've traveled to some of these places where the sectarian cleansing has occurred, and at times what we find is there's a lot more fighting, obviously. There are rebel presences in these areas. It's not simply the Syrian government is attacking necessarily civilians. These are areas that are generally sympathetic to the revolution or participating in the revolution. And as you said, there's the Alawis at this point have they do really, it seems, have two options. I mean, I haven't heard any of the rebel groups offer any sort of idea about what transitional justice looks like, other than we would like to kill them. And I think in part that window has passed. I mean, some people said things like, 6 months ago, we asked the international community for help to end this quickly so that this wouldn't drag on, and now the killing has gone on so long, don't come crying to us when we kill all the Alawites. And, quite literally those words. And so I think that's the general sense, especially around Homs, where for at least since the end of last year, it's been very pronounced as an Alawi Shia versus Sunnah conflict with a small Christian minority, I think very much feeling trapped in the middle. There's been a lot of talk about Christians being targeted specifically for being Christian. I've seen no direct evidence of that. I've seen Christians targeted because they were associated with the government. The rebels are very open about that. There are definitely, segue from there into, there are definitely, I think everyone knows that quite a few Syrians are Muslims. So there are, sorry, is that too close? Okay. So there are what we would think of as jihadis or Islamist factions amongst the rebels. At this point, the stated goal from virtually every group you come across is we want to get rid of Assad. In more candid moments, the rebels will talk about their fears for what happens after the fall of the government. Are we going to have various rebel groups with various visions for what a post-Assad Syria looks like, fighting over that vision? I think that's probably a very real and very likely possibility. And the rebels talk about that themselves. You also hear people say, these complaints about the Islamist factions receiving the bulk of the support seem to be well-founded. People are channeling aid from the Gulf through Syrians in the Syrian diaspora. It seems to be largely happening that way to groups that code as Salafi groups. And amongst these fighters, I've met a number of fighters who were in Iraq. I spent a lot of time reporting from Iraq, and so often the conversation goes there. If I mention that I've been to Iraq, sometimes half the guys in the room will raise their hand and go, "Hey, have you been to Fallujah?" Do you remember 2004? And the fighters and the government, the Syrian government, have frequently referred to Homs as Fallujah, and that's very loaded, and they both have their own ideas about what that means. But that is a very real element to this. For me, it's been truly fascinating because in Iraq, after 2004, as an American correspondent, I didn't have access to these guys. It was almost impossible to meet with the Sunnah resistance or insurgents or terrorists, whatever you want to call them. And so, now, I'm welcome amongst them, and it's been very interesting to see how they fight, to see how they train, to see how they've become very adept at building roadside bombs. They are fighting a military that does not have the best equipment. We're talking about, I think to some extent, the strength of the Syrian military has been overstated, and especially, they're using old Russian armored personnel carriers and tanks that can be taken out with an RPG-7 without necessarily an armor-piercing RPG. The long-range shelling in the helicopters is still a serious issue, but they do seem to be occasionally shooting down helicopters that fly low. I mostly saw helicopters flying too high to actually identify what kind of helicopter they were. We did see some strafing and some attacks, but I would say as often as they did seem to be somewhat effective, they also seem to be entirely ineffective, or possibly just spotting for artillery. Going back to the Islamist element amongst the rebels, there are also people who have told me, yeah, we grew a beard and we went and asked for money. So just because they say they're Salafis doesn't always mean they're Salafis or jihadis. There have been no, I haven't seen any reports, or I haven't experienced any groups necessarily enacting any kind of, I guess, Sharia law or, Islamic law in the areas they control. I mean, we have seen them setting up courts that draw from not just local imams, but other local leaders as well. Rural Syria is often a very conservative place, so it's not surprising that you would see a lot of fighters, a lot of rebels who are pious or observant. You also see lots that aren't. And the Salafis themselves, I mean, I've spent a lot of time with a few different Salafi battalions. They consider themselves somewhat moderate. They do say, yes, we would like to see something that looks more like Egypt, where Islamic political parties are allowed to contest elections. That is perhaps the most articulated vision I've heard for what Syria or what Syrian politics looks like post-Assad. We want other parties to be able to participate that may not espouse necessarily secular ideals, and so I don't think that's terribly shocking.
Okay, great.